Welcome back, everyone. This is Moe Alsumidaie at the Veeva R&D and Quality Summit here in Boston. And I'm sitting here with Jeff Sorenson, who's the CEO of Yunu, and Steve Tolle, who's the Chief Product Officer and Technology Officer with Ignitedata. Pleasure to have you both here.
Thank you, Mo.
Thanks. Yeah.
So my first question to you guys is, we're really talking about R3 and the updates in the R3 guidance. They really call for imaging workflows in there. If you look specifically in the document, there is a reference for that. And those workflows are to be auditable and accessible all the way through the readiness process, not just at the EISF level. How do you see that shift changing the psychology of trial oversight for sponsors, CROs, and regulators?
Yeah, I think it's really important for sponsors to understand this difference. So I'm glad you pointed it out. What's historically happened is whatever processes are happening in radiology and in the background, sometimes even the investigators themselves are filling out these forms, which can add bias. Once the lesions are measured, the calculations are done according to a protocol. It ends up being a PDF, but there's no traceability back to the formulas and to the lesion measurements that were made on the images. So the pixel data isn't tied to the measurement data on that form. And so I think what's really happening now with both sites and sponsors is they're rightfully viewing this next set of guidance as being an RBQM process. There's a risk-based quality management gap that's pretty severe. And I think for imaging, it's severe. Maybe for other data types, it's less severe. And Steve can talk about some of those. But for imaging, they don't have the tools. We'll probably talk more about this later. But the PACS system has no concept of the protocol. It doesn't track what lesions were measured. You typically have the separate data team doing calculations. And if a lesion's measured then incorrectly, then how is that ever fixed? How is that communicated? So what I loved about the guidance is it focused on workflow, and that is the missing element. Is however you do it, even if you did it on paper or you did it with a platform, you have to be able to trace it all the way through. And I think that's really what they're saying, is there has to be source data verification, which is probably a great tie to what Ignitedata does.
Mm-hmm. A lot of what we do at Ignite is how do you solve for speed, accuracy, and then the data provenance. And when someone's audited, we have to be able to point back to exactly where that source data came from. There has to be absolutely no confusion about how that source data ended up in the electronic data capture system. And so the reason we partnered with Yunu to handle the imaging workflow is that they can hand us that transaction precisely back to that source file, so that an auditor, regardless of whether it's a sponsor or a regulator, can know exactly where that data came from.
So currently, imaging doesn't really have a true source. We're looking at these data systems at the site level. So unlike EDC, which has an audit trail, a real source, or lab data, for example, is some real source. Like, you don't really see much of that for imaging on the site level. So can you share a story from your work where that gap created an unexpected trial complication, and how the industry might be able to bridge that?
Yeah, I mean, we're onboarding many cancer centers, and as part of that, just to explain the data and the insights that I'll be talking about here, in order to do the next calculation, you need to know the initial baseline, you need to know the nadir, which is the lowest point that the lesions were measured, the best patient response, and then you need to know the prior and the one you measured. Those are the requirements to do the next calculation. And so when onboarding trials at a cancer center, then we're pulling that data in and we're comparing it to the protocol. And so we're going to find the errors, right? It's like a double check of those values. And so, there's a lot of work that's been published, and some great work by your organization, Mo, as you're aware. But the reality is that we see 25 to 50% of all imaging assessments on all patients and all trials have an error. Now, what does that mean? What's the human cost of that? And what's a story I could tell? Well, once you've done one thing wrong once and you don't detect it, you're going to do that every time. So as an example, this is one of many examples, hundreds of examples. In one therapeutic area, there were 25 sponsors with 51 trials running, and they were using the wrong response criteria. And so the reality is, I'm very passionate actually about this guidance, because it means when you start to trace things all the way through, you understand what the data is. And that means that you can trust the results. And when you drive that mechanism of workflow and trust, it means you catch your errors and you don't repeat your errors. Without that control mechanism, you simply don't know. And so, the most common errors include in the top 5 picking the wrong response criteria, literally picking the wrong formula applied to the right lesions, and it's not being caught by sponsors. So this is a real call to action being done by this guidance, and I think it is the right thing to do. Our data shows the time is now to get this right.
What I would add, it's been 15 years since meaningful use first started, right? And we've seen this huge adoption by health systems of electronic health records. And yet the gold standard for clinical trials is still, regardless of where the data sits digitally at source, I'm going to transcribe it into an electronic data capture system, which by default has a 7 to 12% error rate. And the industry is okay with that, which is a little crazy 15 years after we spent all of this money as a country to modernize our healthcare interoperability infrastructure. So, we're starting to move this data that sits digitally at source with high accuracy, with very quick response times over to the sponsor's electronic data capture system. The key, though, is to be able to point back to where did it come from and how do we know it came from there? And has it changed? You have to do change detection as well, because the sponsor needs to know that a preliminary lab result, for example, has been updated. So, it's taken the industry a long time to get to a point where we can modernize it, and still less than 1% of clinical trials a day are using this technology. But the demand is there because the technology is there, thankfully, in large part to the FHIR standard that's matured, which helps us move things like lab data, vitals data. But, when we look at imaging, if you think about oncology clinical trials, this is the endpoint that everyone cares about, and we've got to do a better job of making it available.
And so with sponsors now, R3 is basically making sponsors a lot more accountable for oversight, right? And if you don't have very good oversight systems, well, too bad, regulators are not going to be focusing on that now. And if you're not demonstrating that oversight, you could get hit with penalties, right? So now that, they're accountable for acting on known site imaging error rates, how do you think that responsibility now, given these new regulations, will affect sponsor-site relationships, especially in communities, for example, where trust and hierarchy are fragile?
Yeah, I think it is a good point. And I'm an optimist on this front. I think technology is really gonna bring the solution. So the reality for sponsors is they have to have a systemic methodology to codify a solution. There is no system making imaging endpoints in these sites that is accurate. It's in shadow files. There is no workflow, which we talked about. And so therefore the question is, how do you go about change management? And then, how much is too much to ask? And in reality, anything more is too much to ask of a site. They're already asking too much of the site. And this is where technology comes in. We don't stress about our, Visa credit card transaction and whether that's going to overwhelm the system and break down in a workflow on somebody's desk, because there's no people in the workflow. And so you can have a responsive, technology-driven, site-centric solution that solves the problem because it's end-to-end. And really the key is to be complete. Imaging is really tough because you don't just need the workflow and the data management and the query management, but you also need the measurement tools and the protocol compliance to be able to make the measurements. But I think for sponsors, the change management is going to become easy because the ask to the site is actually less because the system is doing the work. And since I think I heard a stat, it was a couple of years ago, so I don't know what the current one is, but that there was 7 CRC jobs for every one available candidate. So the world is out of humans. Technology can do a better job, and let's rethink this. And the beauty there is when you talk about communities, the only way to bring ivory tower clinical care into the community is to make it truly decentralized. And that means collecting all of the data. And for Yunu, we can cast a trial across all the sites. For Ignitedata, once you've mapped the EHR and the health system, it works for everyone. So technology is going to mean that clinical trials work for everyone and not just the select few.
And what do you think behavioral science tells us about why these pain points persist? Like, are there cultural or systemic changes that might alleviate them?
I think it really comes down to the art of the possible and human nature. So people are working in silos inside these health systems, even the big, highly organized NCI designated. Their data team will go and fetch imaging from the PAC system and not go fetch imaging from the system it was measured on if that system is a different system. They will manually de-identify data because they have to go find it. So if all you did was make sure you knew who did what, where, when, that those breadcrumbs alone would mean you could go grab the data and do something and give it to them. So I don't think it's like a behavioral science problem. I think the world has been willing to cope with throwing bodies at problems. And now the world is saying enough is enough. And sponsors and regulators and patients are all saying, I will only participate if it's easier.
I would say that you also have the compounding effect of budget cuts. So you've got sites now that just learned last week that there are changes coming to their reimbursement, and they're already making decisions about headcount this week. Their budgets are that tight. And so it is about what's possible, and it's how big is the IT lift to deploy this kind of technology. And if we make it really easy to use, and we can show that we're increasing the productivity of these research coordinators by 50 to 70%, you're going to get adoption. And the sponsors now know what's possible. They all want to know, did the test happen, right? Every ECRF says, were labs taken? You have to check the box, yes or no, right? In imaging, they want to know, has the image actually been scheduled? They want to know where the participant is in the study. We can now do that. And so I think it's going to change their behavior because they now know what's possible. And I think the regulatory change certainly will help because it'll drive. But you've got to factor in the reality of budget cuts and that we've got to use technology to improve productivity.
And so if central review, BICR, if those could be done at the click of a button, how would you change the decision-making biases for both regulators accustomed to long cycles and for sponsors balancing speed with rigor?
Well, I think, sort of harkening back to some of our previous discussion, you can have rigor and 1 second responsiveness when you're on a technology platform. I think where the sponsors and CROs are going to be challenged to think about what this all means is the level of agility that it offers. So they've never had the agility to say, well, what if it's too difficult to train my reader at every site? What if I just collected the data and did a real-time read? What if I didn't bother my site to go find the data a second time, but I collected source data and just had it read out, and now I've got my source data and I've got my first read? But that's going to challenge them to think, well, wait a minute, that is a blinded read. That's an unaffiliated reader. So now my site read can be my first blinded read. My source data, I don't have to wait weeks to get it. So really that's where technology companies, then we build the possibilities, and now they can incorporate these new capabilities into what does it mean for a collect and hold. It can be much more affordable and quick. For sites to DID data and send it out, it can be much easier. So they'll do more of that. For communities and site networks, set up a trial once, cast it out to all the sites. So I think really everyone has to be scalable because you got to be able to do everything in the trial. That's a given. But what we are that they haven't really fully digested, in my opinion, is just the agility and the responsiveness. And when you look at what that means for the people working in these systems, you start to build trust. We already see that where if monitors understand the tech and the tech already has all the settings to do the math right, once you've checked it 300 times, you can sort of look for outliers instead of checking every data value. And imagine what that means for like staffing. If you only need to look for outliers and outliers stand out as a dot on a chart, that's the new world of agility, where you're literally focusing your time and effort where it needs to be and not everywhere because you don't know what's going on.
I would add, our platform is a human in the loop platform. All right, so you have a research coordinator inside the electronic health record, and they're going to go move the data for that visit, for that cycle. It could be labs, vitals, imaging. What we learned is that they've got to trust that the data is accurately reflected because they're going to rely on that integration. Now, they can always go manually read documents that they have to read to find things like patient history that aren't going to show up in the Fire server, for example. But the trust that the user has in the platform is critical. And it really is going to flow down from the sponsors to the sites. And it's a different trust equation because different people have different jobs to do. But our key learning here is that the research coordinators, it takes a little bit of time for them to really trust the application.
Mhm.
Once they do, there's a tipping point, and then their productivity skyrockets.
And so, looking 10 years ahead, if you were to reimagine an end-to-end trial model that fully integrates imaging, what elements would you keep human-driven versus what you would entrust entirely to automation, as Steve was just talking about?
Well, for me, I think these are life-changing decisions for patients. And we all have loved ones who have been impacted by cancer. Um, and so I think there could be a lot more time spent on, compassionate discussion of options based on the freed up resources. So I think that should always be there. Humans want to trust humans. Now, humans with better data, that's even better. But I don't think there's a world where humans aren't sitting down with someone who is not a professional in this area to understand their results. And the other side of sort of the arch is regulators, where I've worked in advanced medical imaging domains my whole career. It takes 20 years to build a standard. So if I built something that was demonstrably and provably perfect at doing the measurements, it would still be a very complicated argument. I guarantee you there would be 300 or 400 white papers, and the 401st one would say more data is needed. That's what that 401st one is going to say. And so it's difficult for them to decide as a regulator, what's the jumping off point where I don't need a human to make the actual important endpoint that is the primary endpoint on this trial. So the two things where people are needed and needed more is on the far ends of this arch, and everything in between is a coping mechanism that we can largely automate away happily by all stakeholders involved. That's my thought.
Yeah, I think it all comes down to the regulator's comfort level with automation. If you look at some of the hybrid models today where things like central lab data goes straight into a data warehouse and doesn't really get verified because people assume it's accurate, we're going to get to that same level of comfort, I believe, with some of the source data coming out of these source systems, because it is being transferred accurately. Now, there will always be risk-based monitoring, and there will always be, opportunities to look for outliers. But at some point, the regulators will get comfortable with the source system being trusted. But we've got a ways to go. That 401st white paper is going to have to be written.
Such a pleasure, guys. We have Steve Tolle, Chief Product and Technology Officer at Ignitedata, and Jeff Sorenson, who's CEO at Yunu. Thank you both for joining me here.
Thank you, Mo. Really appreciate it.